deemed that no criminal investigation was necessary, and the Information Commissioner has continued to work with the department throughout. However, journalists were almost immediately aware of the breach, and the previous administration applied to the High Court for an injunction to prevent the data loss becoming public. The judge deemed the risk warranted going further, and on the 1st of September 2023, granted a super injunction, which prevented the disclosure of the very existence of the injunction. Mr. Speaker, that super injunction has been in place for nearly 2 years, during which time 8 media organisations and their journalists have been served to prohibit any reporting. And no government wishes to withhold information from the British public, from parliamentarians, or the press in this manner. In autumn 2023, previous ministers started work on establishing a new settlement scheme, specifically designed for people in this compromised data set who were not eligible for ARAP. Not eligible for ARAP, but nevertheless judged to be at the highest risk of reprisals by the Taliban. It is known as the Afghan Response Route, ARR. It was covered by the super injunction. And the then government initially established the ARR to resettle a target cohort of around 200 principals. But in early 2024, a combination of the Minister's decisions on the scheme's policy design and the court's views had broadened this category to nearly 3,000 principals. I want to provide assurance, Mr. Speaker, both to the House and to the British public, that all individuals relocated under the Afghan Response Route, ARAP, or the Home Office's ACRS scheme undergo strict national security checks before being able to enter our country. And the full number of Afghan arrivals under all schemes have been reported in the regular Home Office statistics, meaning that they are already counted in the existing migration figures. Now, as Shadow Defence Secretary, I was initially briefed on the ARR by James Heappey, the former Armed Forces Minister, on the 12th of December 2023, and issued with the super injunction at the start of that meeting. Other members of the present Cabinet were only informed of the evidence of the data breach, the operation of the ARR, and the existence of the super injunction on taking office after the general election. By this time, the ARR scheme was fully established and in operation. By this time, it was nearly 2.5 years since the data loss. I have felt deeply concerned about the lack of transparency to Parliament and to the public. I felt it only right to assess the decision-making criteria for the ARR. So we began straight away to take a hard look at the policy complexities, the costs, the risks, the court hearings, and the range of Afghan relocation schemes that the previous government was running. Cabinet colleagues endorsed the need for new insights into the scheme in autumn last year while the scheme kept running, and in December 2024, I announced the streamlining of the range of government schemes that we inherited into the Afghan resettlement programme to better establish value for money, establish a single set of time-limited entitlements, and support to get the Afghan families resettled. And I would like to thank, on behalf of the House, Mr. Speaker, our colleagues in local government, without whom this unified resettlement programme would simply not be possible. And then at the beginning of this year, I commissioned Paul Rimmer, a senior former civil servant, an ex-deputy director of the Chief of Defence Intelligence, to conduct an independent review. This review was concluded and reported to ministers last month. Today, I'm releasing a public version of Rimmer's review, and I'm placing a copy of that in the library of the House. I'm very grateful to him for his work. Mr. Speaker, despite brutal human rights abuses in Afghanistan, the Rimmer Review notes the passage of time, nearly 4 years since the fall of Kabul, and concludes, first, and I quote, "There is little evidence of intent by the Taliban to conduct a campaign of retribution against former officials. Second, those who pose a challenge to the Taliban rule now are at greater risk of a reaction from the regime. Three, the wealth of data inherited from the former government by the Taliban would already enable them to target individuals if they wish to do so. Which means, fourthly, he concludes, and I quote, "It is highly unlikely that merely being on the spreadsheet would be the piece of information enabling or prompting the Taliban to act." However, Rimmer is clear. He stresses the uncertainty in any judgments, and he does not rule out any risk. Yet he concludes, given this updated context, that the current policy we inherited appears, and I quote, "an extremely significant intervention to address the potentially limited net additional risk the incident likely presents." Mr. Speaker, the Rimmer Review is a very significant but not the sole element in the government's decision to change policy. To close the ARR, and to ensure that court order is lifted today. Policy concerns about proportionality, about public accountability, about cost, about fairness were also important factors to the government. And this was not a decision taken lightly. It follows a lengthy process, including the Rimmer Review, detailed ministerial discussions, and repeated consultations with legal advisors. And just as I have changed government policy in light of the Rimmer Review, so the High Court today, in light of the Rimmer Review, ruled that there is no tenable basis for the continuation of the super injunction. Mr. Speaker, to date, 900 ARR principals are in Britain or in transit, together with 3,600 family members, at a cost of around £400 million. From today, there will be no new ARR offers of relocation to Britain. From today, the route is now closed. However, we will honour the 600 invitations already made to any named persons still in Afghanistan and their immediate family. When this nation makes a promise, we should keep it. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'm also restoring full accountability for the government's Afghan relocation scheme to Parliament. And I would expect our select committees to hold us account now through the in-depth inquiries. Let me turn, if I may, now to the practical action that we've taken as a result of this policy change and in preparation for the lifting of the court super injunction. Mr. Speaker, my first concern has been to notify as many as possible affected by the data incident and provide them with further advice. The MOD has done this morning, although I have to say to the House it has not been possible to contact every individual on the dataset due to its incomplete and out-of-date information. However, anyone who may be concerned can head to our new dedicated gov.uk website, wherein they will find more information about the data loss, further security advice, a self-checker tool which will inform them whether their application has been affected, and contact steps for the Detailed Information Services Centre, which the MOD has established. Mr. Speaker, this serious data incident should never have happened. It may have occurred 3 years ago under the previous government, but to all those whose information was compromised, I offer a sincere apology today on behalf of the British government. And I trust the Shadow Defence Secretary as a former Defence Minister, will join me in this. Mr. Speaker, to date, 36,000 Afghans have been accepted by Britain through the range of relocation schemes. Britain has honoured the duty we owe to those who worked and fought alongside our troops in Afghanistan. The British people have welcomed them to our country, and in turn, this is their chance to rebuild their lives, their chance to contribute and to share in the prosperity of our great country. However, none of these relocation schemes can carry on in perpetuity, nor were they conceived to do so. That's why on the 1st of July, we announced that we would no longer accept new applicants to ARAP. However, I will reiterate the commitment we made then to process every outstanding ARAP application and relocate those who may prove eligible. And we will complete our commitment to continuing the review of the triples. Mr. Speaker, I recognise my statement will prompt many questions. I would have wanted to settle these matters sooner, because full accountability to Parliament and freedom of the press matter deeply to me. They're fundamental to our British way of life. However, lives may have been at stake. And I've spent many hours thinking about this decision, thinking about the safety and the lives of people I will never meet in a far-off land in which 457 of our servicemen and women lost their lives. So this weighs heavily on me, and it's why no government could take such decisions lightly without sound grounds and hard deliberations. During this last year, we have conducted and we have now completed this work. I commend this statement to the House.
Secretary of State James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Secretary of State both for advance side of his statement and for receipt early this morning of a hard copy of the Rimmer Review. And can I thank the Secretary of State and the Minister of the Armed Forces for briefing me yesterday and for briefing other parliamentary colleagues today. Furthermore, given the nature of the super injunction, Mr. Speaker, and the fact that the timing and nature of this statement relates entirely to the court's lifting of that super injunction, I also recognise that it was entirely right for the Secretary of State to update the House at the earliest opportunity and welcome the opportunity colleagues now have to scrutinise these matters. To declare an interest, Mr. Speaker, I was a minister at the MOD in August 2023 when the department first became aware of the breach. My main role being to chair one meeting on the matter in August 2023 because I was the duty minister, but thereafter being Minister for Defence Procurement and this sitting outside my portfolio, I had relatively minimal direct involvement. That said, the Secretary of State has issued an apology on behalf of the government, and I join him in that, and in recognising that this data leak should never have happened and was an unacceptable breach of all relevant data protocols. And I agree it is right that an apology is issued specifically to those whose data was compromised. It is nevertheless a fact that cannot be ignored that when this breach came to light, the immediate priority of the then government was to avoid a very specific and terrible scenario, namely, an error by an official of the British state leading to torture or even murder of persons in the data set at the hands of what remains a brutal Taliban regime. As the Rimmer Review confirms, that scenario, thankfully, appears to have been avoided. Of course, the Rimmer Review was set up in January and reported to the Secretary of State in June, as we understand. I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker, it is entirely appropriate that the Secretary of State has sought to update the department's understanding of the threat on the ground in Afghanistan that exists today, particularly for those persons in the data set who had previously been concluded to be at greatest risk of reprisals. However, the House will appreciate that when ministers became aware of this data breach in August 2023, we did not have the luxury of 6 months to assess the situation. As Rimmer says at paragraph 53, and I quote, the review notes that the passage of time is particularly relevant. And I know that my former ministerial colleague, former Minister of the Armed Forces, James Heappey, who led the response to the leak, will have been focused entirely on what he saw as his duty of care to those at risk of reprisals, based on the threat assessment that pertained at the time. But any threat picture is constantly evolving. And as I say, I support the Secretary of State's decision to review the MOD's understanding of the threat. And given the latest situation as reported by Rimmer, we support his conclusion that the Afghanistan response route, the ARR, can now be closed. Turning to the super injunction, I do entirely understand why this will be the subject of considerable interest, particularly for the newspapers and media outlets concerned. We have an independent judiciary, and it is not for me to comment on either the decision to grant the injunction in the first place, nor to lift it today. But it is surely telling that the Rimmer Review paragraph 56 states that planning at the time the government became aware of this breach in the summer of 2023 was based, and I quote directly, on a risk judgment that were the Taliban to secure access to the data set, the consequences for affected individuals may be serious. Had that not been the case, no doubt the court would have been less likely to grant the injunction, and certainly not a super injunction. So on the leak, can the Secretary of State confirm that this was by a civil servant and that ministers at the time took steps to change the casework procedure, i.e. not using spreadsheets sent by email, but moving to a more secure system fully within the entirely secure network? And can he confirm that although the data set was circa 18,000, only a relatively small portion of that data set was identified as being at high risk of reprisals, and only a small number have been settled here, which is why, as he stated today, the cost is around £400 million, not the figure of £7 billion that is being reported elsewhere? And can I agree with him that now that these matters are rightly in the public domain, that given the reassessment of the threat in the Rimmer Review, it would be wholly appropriate for the Select Committee and others to look into these matters further? Can the Secretary of State comment on one very specific item being reported? That, and I'm not referring to the person who made the leak, but another apparent third party who obtained some of the data was engaged in blackmail. Did the original Metropolitan Police investigation look at this? And if not, will he consider reopening it so that the police can have another look at that very specific point, which is very serious in its implications? Finally, we must recognise the huge role played by Afghan nationals in support of our armed forces. But any policy in this area must always be balanced against our own national interest. We support the government in closing the ARR scheme, and as we did with their decision to close the full Arab programme.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the tone in which the Shadow Defence Secretary has responded? Can I welcome him joining me in the apology on behalf of the British Government to those whose data has been compromised? And can I welcome also his acceptance that he put it, it's entirely appropriate for the Defence Secretary now, as part of a new government, to look to up-to-date the department's assessment of the threat. And I am very pleased, and the House will have noted, that he supports Rimmer's conclusions and my policy judgments that the government has announced today. He is right. Rimmer, in simple terms, gives us a revised, up-to-date assessment of the risk, and in particular the risk of those individuals whose data may be on that spreadsheet. And he does confirm, highly unlikely, that their name on the data set increases the risk of them being targeted. Mr. Speaker, he asked me 3 or 4 specific questions. He asked about the official. It was a defence official. I can't account for the improvements in data handling that the previous ministers might have taken. What I can say, when I did his job in that period of opposition, was that this data leak was just one of many from the Afghan schemes at the time. And what I can say is that since the election in this last year, we as a government have appointed a new Chief Information Officer. We have installed new software to securely share data. And we have also completed a comprehensive review of the legacy Afghan data on the casework system. On the question of the £7 billion, Mr. Speaker, which I think he may have picked up from court papers, this was a previous estimate. It is not related simply to the Afghan recovery route. It is an estimate of the total cost of all government Afghan schemes for the entire period in which they may operate. And the significance of the decision that I've announced today means that that cost to the taxpayer as a result of the policy decisions we've taken today, compared to simply continuing the policy and schemes we'd inherited, means that the taxpayer will pay 1.2 billion less over this period. It means that around 9,500 fewer Afghans will come to this country. And above all, it means that we have restored proper accountability in this House and proper freedom of the media.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tamerji Singh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, welcome it, and indeed his intent to now inject parliamentary transparency and scrutiny. However, this whole data breach situation is a mess and is wholly unacceptable. As I mentioned to the Minister for the Armed Forces during our recent secret briefing, that I am certainly minded to recommend to my Defence Committee colleagues that we thoroughly investigate to ascertain what has actually transpired here, given the serious ramifications on so many levels. However, as things stand, notwithstanding the contents of the RIMA review, how confident is my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, that the Afghans affected, many of whom bravely supported our service personnel, will not be at risk of recriminations and reprisals?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can only recommend that he reads in full the public version of the RIMA report that I've published today. The conclusions and the updated risk assessment that RIMA sets out, taking an up-to-date view, recognising that the situation in Afghanistan is now nearly 4 years on from the point at which the Taliban took control, recognising also that the present regime sees those who may threaten the regime itself now as a greater threat to their operation than any perhaps former government official or serving official. So I'd recommend that he reads that, and I expect, as the Defence Select Committee Chair, he will want to take full advantage of this restored parliamentary accountability. I've always believed that our Select Committee system in this House is perfectly capable and actually better suited to many of the in-depth inquiries that often get punted into public inquiries or punted into calls for public inquiries. And I hope my honourable friend would have noted the fact that the Shadow Defence Secretary also endorsed that view.
Why the Liberal Democrats spokesperson?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I also thank the Minister of the Armed Forces for his briefing on this issue and this morning. I'm pleased that this House now has the opportunity to scrutinise this alarming data breach. And it's right that the then government moved to introduce a new scheme to try to minimise the risk to the Afghan soldiers and their families who were caught up in this breach, of the 18,714 individuals in total. It's the very least that we owe them, given the sacrifices they made to support our campaign in Afghanistan. And I welcome the apologies from both sides of the House as a result of this data breach. But it does raise serious questions about how this was allowed to happen under the Conservatives' watch and the heightened level of risk it has created for those Afghans involved. So can the Minister confirm what steps have been taken to address the root cause of this breach and to ensure that it cannot happen again? Reporting this afternoon from the Financial Times suggested that an original relocation scheme considered for all 25,000 Afghan personnel could cost up to £7 billion. So will the Secretary of State confirm what assessment his department has made of that figure and why this was kept hidden from the public? The immediate priority must be to ensure the safety of all those individuals caught up in this breach. So what assurances can the Secretary of State provide that lifting of this super injunction now doesn't heighten any dangers for those individuals concerned? And what steps is he taking to ensure that the individuals whose data was leaked are aware of the incident? What additional support is now being provided to them directly now that the case is in the public domain? And in light of these developments, can the Secretary of State outline when the casework and final relocations under this and the ARAP scheme will be completed by?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome her response? Can I say that I actually provided answers to the House for 2 or 3 of her questions directly to the Shadow Defence Secretary on the steps that we've taken to ensure that one can never say never, but one can, and I am more confident than I was 12 months ago about the reduced risk of data losses and data breaches in future. I've also given a response on the 7 billion figure. The estimated full costs of all Afghan schemes that will run to their completion from start to finish because of the savings derived from the policy decisions we've taken today will be between 5.5 and 6 billion pounds. The cost of the ARR scheme to date, the cost and the sums committed to bring the 900 principals and their immediate families that are in Britain or in transit is around 400 million. And I expect a similar sum to be the cost of those still to come. Mr. Speaker, finally, on RIMA, I think I said in my statement to the House that RIMA recognises the uncertainties, recognises the brutal nature of the Afghan Taliban regime, recognises that there can never be any risk, there can never be no risk in any judgments and decisions like this. It's one of the reasons that this is a decision that the government and I have taken with hard deliberation and serious intent. And Mr. Speaker, I hope that the House will back it this afternoon.
Dame Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by saying I'm grateful to the ministerial team for the early briefing that I got on this matter, which gave me an opportunity to read a report that came out from the FAC under the chairmanship of the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge and Malling. It was begun in September 21 and the report came out in 22. It's called Missing in Action, UK Leadership and the Withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was excoriating. The manner of the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan was a disaster, a betrayal of our allies, and weakens the trust that helps to keep British people safe. It said the government should keep better records securely held on locally employed staff, and we've heard this is one of the many data losses from ARAP, to ensure that any evacuation can be carried out more effectively. It should devise a policy based on clear and fair principles about the assistance which will be offered to local partners in the event of a security deterioration and report to us when that has been done. I hope that such a policy has been developed, that more lessons have been learned, and that the ministers will report to my committee about where we are now.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that ministers will report to her committee if she invites us to do so. And she's right to make that big argument that anyone providing data to the British government has a right to expect that personal data to be stored securely, handled safely, and not to be subject to the sort of loss or breach that too often we saw with the early days of the Afghan relocation schemes.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
I commend the Secretary of State for his honesty and agree with everything he says in his statement. What an appalling mess, but part of the original sin of us intervening militarily and then scuffling out. Can I take it on a wider point that we've learnt our lesson now and we've got over the sort of liberal imperial itch of the Cameron and Blair areas to intervene militarily in ungovernable countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria and Libya? Let's now just move on, but I support what he said.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his remarks. I'm certainly grateful to his for his support for my statement this afternoon. Although he hasn't said it, he's a big champion of press freedom, and I expect that he also recognises that an important part of our decision has been this period in which we've seen no public knowledge, no media reporting, no parliamentary accountability, and we set that right today.
Louise Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a former veteran of the war in Afghanistan, I was appalled to watch the chaotic mismanagement following the fall of Kabul that left Afghans that had served alongside us, alongside our troops, and those who'd worked so hard for a better Afghan, dangerously exposed. This was a situation that I'd feared would happen, and I could see coming even when I served in Afghanistan in 2017. The fact is, the previous government had plenty of warning that this situation could happen and failed to plan properly for it. This data breach joins the litany of other data breaches, delays and failures of our allies. And will the Minister therefore agree with me that we must give our fullest support to those Afghans so they can rebuild a new life here in the UK?
Secretary of State.
I do indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I know from Afghan families that were relocated in the early days into our area, my own constituency in South Yorkshire. It was the voices of members of both sides of the House here speaking up in exactly the same terms that she has there, recognising the debt this country owes to many of those who worked alongside or served with our forces, that made the very difficult job that our forces undertook in Afghanistan possible in the first place, and provided a warm welcome and continue to do so to those Afghans we're offering a new home and the chance to rebuild their lives and contribute to our country.
Lincoln John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State's statement and the tone of voice that he delivered it in? I commanded the Scots Guards in 2010 in Afghanistan at the high water mark of violence. I was very well served by Naz and Mukhtar, and I will always be grateful to both the Ministry of Defence for getting them to Britain and to the communities in the country who have welcomed them to their new lives here. I do just want to focus in on a particular phrase that the Secretary of State used. The Shadow Defence Secretary asked whether it was a civil servant who carried out the leak. The Secretary of State said it was a defence official, and the Times is reporting that it was a soldier. I do think it is worth clarifying exactly whether it was a civil servant, a SPAD, or a soldier, because conflating the term defence official to cover members of the armed forces is something which might come back to bite the Secretary of State if he continues to do it.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, this was a data breach that took place 3.5 years ago under the decision and leadership of the previous government and previous defence ministers. The challenge I faced, the challenge this government faced, was far bigger than the actions of one official that long ago. And my full focus since the election in July last year has been to get to grips with the costs, the proportionality or the disproportionality of the schemes in place, and this lack of accountability to Parliament, freedom of the press and public knowledge. And it is that set of factors that has taken up my time and my attention.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I noted that the Shadow Secretary of State made great play about the changes and the extra safeguards the previous government had put in place, the ministers had put in place following this breach. But I also noted that Mr. Speaker, that the Secretary of State said that he'd had to make more changes and introduce new software. That suggests to me that it wasn't the changes that had been put in place by the previous government were not good enough. And can I ask him clearly, in terms of 18 months after the incident, who had knowledge of this in those 18 months that this data breach had taken place before it reached ministers? And how was there no checks on anyone who had access to that sort of data using it properly within the department?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friends poses questions to me in the House this afternoon that I simply can't answer. They date from a period that was well before I took office, and as he above all will appreciate, as a new minister, you have no access to the policy advice, the legal assessments, any of the papers, or even the threat assessments that the previous government and ministers may have commissioned. That sort of subject, if I may, is, I think, proper material for the committee on which he serves in such a distinguished way on the Defence-led Committee, perhaps to take a deeper look and to call witnesses that may be in a better position to answer those questions than I can this afternoon. And finally, on the question of software, I'm afraid I'm one of the last people to be able to give authoritative views on the question of cybersecurity and up-to-date software. But I think it must be in the nature of this that such requirements for new software, for constant updating, is indeed constant. And so the fact that we have taken the steps in the last 12 months that I and our experts have regarded as necessary doesn't necessarily mean that the steps taken by previous ministers were inadequate. But what I can say, of course, is that in the Shadow Defence Secretary's position, during that period of opposition, we were aware, we exposed some of the building backlogs in casework, the regular data breaches, and the broken promises, sad to say, particularly in the early years, that too often characterised these Afghan relocation schemes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too welcome the statement given by the Secretary of State today, and as a member of the Defence Select Committee, I'm looking forward to giving this the due scrutiny that it deserves. So I won't go into the things within the actual report, but I think it's important to clarify. Is the Secretary of State also able to say whether the data breach in question, as in the past, or maybe now, be putting any serving members of the UK armed forces at risk?
So State.
I look forward to being called and giving evidence to his committee, if indeed it does launch such an inquiry. To the best of my knowledge and belief, no serving member of our armed forces is put at risk by the data loss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's staggering to hear yet another serious data breach under the previous Conservative government. Would the Secretary of State, well, they can bicker from the other side, but it was clearly a mistake when they were in power. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that we've inherited a chaotic and poorly managed system, and can he tell us what systems have been put in place to correct this so we won't see more systems where you were emailing an Excel spreadsheet absolutely beggars belief? Can we confirm that this would never happen again?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right in the criticism she levels, but I would just say to her, I don't think any minister can stand here, or no chief executive of any organisation can stand say with guarantee there will never be a data breach, a data loss, or a data error in that way. What I can say is we've taken steps to reduce the risk for that, and that we no longer do any caseworking on spreadsheets, which was in the early days of this scheme, the technology that was available, and part of the problem, I think, for this inadvertent mistake made by the defence official.
Sir Julian.
What worries me more than the lifting of this super injunction is the fact that we've closed down all the Afghan schemes at the very time that undocumented Afghans who felt it necessary to flee to Iran and to Pakistan are being rounded up for forcible repatriation to an Afghanistan led by the Taliban. I understand that the investigation over our obligation to the triples, the special forces that our forces trained, will be continuing, and I welcome that. Can the Secretary of State confirm that despite the closure of the schemes, anybody who is found to have worked very closely with our armed forces, who is in imminent danger, can still be rescued and admitted to this country?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, it is more than 4 years since the previous government, the previous Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, launched on behalf of this country the Afghan relocations and assistance policy with absolute full support across this House. There has been ample time for anyone who could conceivably believe they might qualify to make their application. That scheme and none of these schemes were ever conceived or designed to last in perpetuity, which is why we've closed them at the beginning of this month to any new applicants, which is why I've taken the decision based on RIMA and the other factors I've identified to end the ARR scheme today. But on the ARAP applicants, the sort of Afghans that the Right Honourable Gentleman is concerned about, where there are applications in our system remaining to be processed, we will complete that job. And on the triples, we will complete the second phase of the review that we've given a commitment to them and to this House to undertake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's support for parliamentary transparency and for the work of the committee corridor in this House. And I have no doubt that my excellent colleagues who chair the various committees responsible will do a thorough job of examining this, and hope that he will then facilitate the sharing of any information that may need to be handled in a sensitive manner. When the Labour was last in government, there were a number of breaches of this nature. His predecessor of his asked to be notified of every one, and most of those were human error. So it's great that we're updating the IT systems and dealing with that security. But can he just touch on what elements are going to be put in place to guard against that human error which inevitably creeps in?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, for functions and roles like this, having sound, secure caseworker software, having good training and proper protocols, all of which are now in place, greatly minimises the risk that anything like this data breach that we now find out took place in February 2022 is likely to happen again. And most importantly, I think it also helps to provide the sort of reassurance that anyone should have, that if they are providing data to the British government, to the British state, that should be held and handled securely.
Mark Pritchard.
Mr. Speaker, I feel the Defence Secretary will forgive me, I do detect some wriggling. And the fact is, he justifies this super injunction, not telling Parliament, not telling the press, not telling the public, and unbelievably not telling those Afghans who were potentially in harm's way. And isn't it the case that his argument is actually very thin? Because even the MOD itself admits that Taliban-aligned individuals already had access to the database. So not telling those Afghans they're under harm's way is quite frankly unbelievable. And the precedent of a super junction is very concerning for this place. How do we know there's not another super junction about another leak? But of course he couldn't tell us, could he?
Secretary of State.
Well, I can say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, if there is another super injunction, I've not been read in. But in his own characteristic way, he makes a really important point about how unprecedented, how uncomfortable, how in many ways unconscionable it is to have a super injunction like this in place. I hope in light of that, he will accept what has been a difficult decision to review the risks, the costs, the details of the scheme, the legal hearings that have taken place have all been components of an important policy decision I've been able to announce to the House today, and I hope you will back that.
Catherine Atkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My husband served in Afghanistan and has always felt keenly the debt that our country owes to those who worked alongside and supported our forces. And I know that many of my constituents who also served there feel the same way? Does the Defence Secretary share my concern that if we fail to honour our debts, why would people in future conflicts trust us and support our troops? And does he agree with me that it is the right thing to do that we offer a warm welcome to Afghans who come to our country seeking sanctuary?
So 100%, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend speaks so plainly, so forcefully and so passionately. And it was one of the things that struck me most 4 or 5 years ago in the Shadow Defence Secretary's role, as we debated the obligation to put in place the ARAP scheme, that those who felt fiercest were understandably those who had served. Those who had, in this House, had been part of the 140,000 British men and women over 20 years that had served in Afghanistan, because they recognised just what a debt this country and they owe to people like those that her husband speaks about.
Gentlemen.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's pledge to restore full accountability for the government's relocation schemes. I am saddened that this is the first opportunity that we've had to talk about the closure of the ACRS and ARAP schemes on the floor of this House, given that those were announced by written statement at very short notice only 2 weeks ago. Can I ask a couple of specific questions? On the ARR that we've only found out about today, he mentioned 600 invitations that will be honoured. For those who were not accepted and part of the breach, are they aware of that? On ARAP, it has been closed to new applications, but again, and I've asked the Minister for the Armed Services about this before, what is the communication strategy for updating them? And on ACRS, it was never open to vulnerable women and civil rights defenders that it was aimed to protect. Again, what communication will the government have with those individuals who are in hiding either in Afghanistan or third countries?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, we made the statement about the closure to new applicants of the ARAP scheme and the ACRS scheme that the Home Office runs on the 1st of July. The Honourable Lady will have had opportunities since then to raise those matters in this House if she chose to do so. And on the information to those who may be affected, we will honour those invitations that have been issued to 600 of those ARR individuals, and to everyone else on the data set. We have communicated that the latest position this morning. We are offering access to further advice through the government.uk designated area of the website, and that includes steps that individuals can take if they wish to get in touch with our Information Services Centre, a dedicated centre set up by the MOD in order to deal with questions and concerns that people may have.
Stella Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a very shocking story that the Secretary of State has told us today, and I pay testament to his commitment to transparency about it. I would say that sadly for many of us, for whom that period of time will never leave us and our offices dealing with the hundreds of people ringing in, desperately distraught about what might happen to family relatives, it doesn't surprise us, because I have to be honest with the Secretary of State, this matter is not closed. I join with the member from New Forest East in being desperately concerned that we still have people who would have qualified under these schemes, but because of failures like this, fled Afghanistan or tried to go to other countries. We tried to raise with ministers but could not get meetings with them, and now we discovered there were secret schemes. He will understand that right now MPs' offices across this country will be hearing this and worried that again they will get those phone calls, that again they will have those queries. He's right that there must be parliamentary scrutiny. Can he just assure us that there will be additional resources to support us in supporting our constituents who will come forward, and that he will keep an open mind that even 4 years later there will still be cases that are relevant to this scheme that should be heard and should be giving sanctuary here if we are to honour our debt to those people who kept our forces safe?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend? She has been one of the most active, most assiduous members of this House in championing the cause of constituents who and others who may be trying to get access to the scheme. I just say to her, this is almost 4 years since, it's beyond 4 years since the Arab scheme was first established. There are still 22,000 Arab applicants whose applications will be processed, and where there is eligibility established, they will be offered the relocation that this country has undertaken to give them. And those applicants need not have applied from Afghanistan. Many indeed have. And for the Arab scheme from the outset, one of its most important features with the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan has been that it's been former female Afghans, female Afghans who formerly have worked alongside, and some even served in the Afghan forces alongside our own, that have been potentially at greatest risk, for whom the offer that this country has made to relocate to this country, rebuild and re-establish a life here has been most important.
So Geoffrey Clifton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Secretary of State for his calm and sensible way that he's announced the change in government policy today. Mr. Speaker, I can already announce to the House that since a briefing earlier today, I've made preliminary arrangements for MOD officials to come and address the PAC to examine the cost implications, the 400 million spent so far. And I think the Secretary of State said in parenthesis, there'll be another 400 million for the 600 based in Afghanistan at the moment who have received invitations under the scheme. Can he give me and the House an assurance that those 600 people who must be in some danger, if they do need assistance, that will be rapidly provided?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, right honourable gentleman, is very fast off the mark, and I'm glad that he's already issued his invitation to his committee. So he's asking for figures as chair of the PAC. So the cost of what has been spent and committed in order to bring and get into transit the 900 principals eligible under ARR plus their immediate family members to Britain is around £400 million. For the remaining members of the ARR and the immediate families who've been issued invitations, we expect something similar again. But because of the policy decisions, and he may want to probe this in his committee, that we've been able to announce, and the changes we've been able to announce to the policy and the programs we inherited, it means that the taxpayer should be paying over the next few years 1.2 billion less, and that around 9,500 fewer Afghans will come to this country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government decision to support the lifting of the super injunction today and bring this awful matter properly into the public domain. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it's right and proper that this issue now is fully scrutinised by Parliament?
So State.
Mr. Speaker, I do indeed, and one of the important features for me in being able to make this statement, to set out the details before the House this afternoon, has been that we are now restoring the proper parliamentary accountability of government ministers and decisions we take and schemes that we run and spending that we commit on behalf of the taxpayer to this House. And I look forward to this House in this chamber, but I hope also in the appropriate select committee or committees will undertake that proper constitutional role in a way they've not been able to do so without being constrained over the last 2 years.
Deb Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, a difficult statement for the Secretary of State and no mistake. He says in his statement, though, that this was a breach of very strict data protection protocols. Well, on the basis of this breach and the other breaches around Afghan resettlement, clearly those protocols were not strict enough. He's declined to say whether it was a contractor or whether it was a civil servant or a service personnel. I don't think anyone in this House wants to know who it was. I would like to know how senior that person was, because if it was a junior member of MOD staff, then that is, the delinquency is both systemic and personal. But if it's a senior member of MOD staff. The delinquency is purely personal on the basis of their knowledge and seniority. In this instance, it was brave Afghans, but what reassurance can you give us that brave personnel of the UK forces would not be similarly compromised by a level of delinquency similar to this in the MOD? And why the synchronicity with the lifting of the super injunction and the ending of the schemes? Isn't it more likely that we should walk a mile on the people who have fled the Afghan regime and think that maybe we need an ARR plus wash-up to get these people out of danger if it becomes a reality?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I wanted this House to hear the policy decisions that I had made and wanted to announce. I wanted this House to hear that first. The judge, aware of the decisions that the government had taken, the announcements I was planning to make today, has taken his decision to lift the super injunction and deliver his court judgment at noon this afternoon. Look, on the question of the individual responsible for that original data loss, that's not something I'm prepared to pursue in this House. It's not something that it was clearly the overarching responsibility of ministers at the time. And I would just say to him, my full focus has been to get to grips with what we inherited, to take a fresh look at the policy that was in place, and to be able to be in a position with the proper degree of deliberation and sound grounds to be able to come to this House this afternoon and announce the changes that I've done.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure, like many members of the House, I feel a sense of anger that once again the Afghan people have been betrayed. I thank the Secretary of State for his candour in his responses and for lifting the super injunction, which will allow proper parliamentary scrutiny. But will he assure me the three questions in particular will be answered? One, how a year was allowed to pass between the initial leak and it being uncovered. Two, how an email with a spreadsheet attached was considered a serious way to send around what effectively amounted to a kill list of Afghans for the Taliban. And three, it has been referred to the role of James Heapy in overseeing this. What role, if any, was held by the two Secretaries of State for Defence at the time, one who served until August 2023 and one who served from August 2023, to my mind, either side of the information coming to light? If we do not get to the bottom of those questions, we do an immense disservice to the British people, but worse, an immense disservice to the Afghans who've been let down once again.
State.
Well, my honourable friend signals some of the areas that the necessary parliamentary scrutiny will consider. I have to say to him, it was 18 months, not 1 year, between the original data loss and it first being discovered and brought to Minister's attention in August 2023. It was a spreadsheet. Sorry, the second point was this. This was a period in which officials were and the department was working at breakneck speed to put in place schemes that were novel, schemes that were urgently needed, and clearly that sort of spreadsheet software is inappropriate for this case working system and is no longer used in that way. And then finally, I just would say he's asking about the role of my predecessors. It was Grant Shapps, who was the Defence Secretary, who oversaw the design, the extension, the establishment of the ARR scheme.
O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As well as risking lives, this extraordinary error has cost taxpayers huge sums. The Secretary of State says it will now cost 1.2 billion less, but what will be the total cost of all these schemes after that? First, given the extraordinary lack of transparency that this Parliament has been subjected to and voters to, will the Secretary of State agree to publish the legal advice that led to the expansion of the ARR and other schemes so we can have a proper discussion about it? And second, the Secretary of State did not mention any official resigning or being sacked over this extraordinary episode. And I think my constituents will find that quite surprising. Will he name the number of people who have resigned or been sacked over this extraordinary error? And if nobody has resigned of his act, does he agree that that is the wrong thing?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not in a position to make a decision about publishing the legal advice that led the previous government and Defence Secretary to extend the scheme. It's not legal advice that I have had access to or seen. And I just say to him on the question of costs, his right honourable friend, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, will do that. He's not in his place now, actually, but he will do the job on this. I can confirm for this House this afternoon that the total cost of all Afghan relocation schemes to date for those 36,000 Afghans that have been brought to this country is around 2.7 billion. The expected cost over the entire life of those schemes to bring anyone who may subsequently be proved eligible for these schemes is between 5.5 and 6 billion pounds, and that is at least 1.2 billion less because of the policy decisions that I've taken this afternoon.
Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for his openness and transparency and his apology. And whilst I'm on my feet, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank Portsmouth City Council for their involvement in Afghan resettlement schemes, many of those who served along my constituency members in Portsmouth North. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the decision today and the time this government has rightly taken to consider all of the options and examine the complexities through the RIMA review, the cost to taxpayers and the safety of those affected, alongside the need for transparency, openness in this House, to the press and also to the public. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, does the Secretary of State agree with me that we must, as a government, reaffirm our commitment to public transparency?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do agree with my honourable friend. This House is doing so this afternoon in response to the statement that I've set out to the House. And can I say to her local council in Portsmouth, the role they are playing and councils across the country are playing in making sure that there is a warm welcome and a unified Afghan resettlement programme in place for those Afghans and their families that we are welcoming into this country is remarkable. We thank them for that, and we as a central government and this House couldn't see these schemes operate effectively without our local councils.
Yeah. Duncan Smith.
Speaker, I commend the Secretary of State's statement today. I'm not going to dwell on the past because that will be something I'm sure the Defence Committee will have a look at and other committees. I want to bring him into where the future goes on this. Now, in closing all these schemes, there are still people out there who may not recognise the statement in this report that says no longer a widespread campaign of targeting individuals. I have one in my mind. The Minister of State knows exactly who I'm referring to, one Sami Atai, who is has fled and is in hiding in Pakistan. His brother has been arrested in their pursuit of him. He didn't get directly employed by the British government because he couldn't have done for security reasons. But testaments from people like General Wally Brown and others all say that he saved lives for British servicemen and women. We owe people like that, surely, a debt of honour and gratitude for their work. So I simply put it to him, could he now look at what might replace the schemes that he's got rid of, which were inflexible, very narrow, and often left out those who really did this government a service. And I'd be grateful if you'd come up with some flexible idea in due course that allows some of these people possibly to seek succour here in the United Kingdom.
I hesitate to be too blunt with the right honourable gentleman because I have a great deal of respect for him. But with any applicant, if they're not eligible for the criteria of the scheme that this House has approved and the government has in place and operates, that can really only lead to one decision. And I don't want to raise false hopes as he encourages me to look in a creative way at other options. My honourable friend, the Armed Forces Minister, is very familiar with this case. We will look at it again, but I don't want to raise false hopes for him or the man that he describes so vividly with such concern to the House this afternoon.
I'm proud that Bracknell Forest is involved in the Afghan resettlement programme and is offering transitional support to the brave Afghans who risk their lives to support our troops. But any scheme like this depends on public trust. So it's concerning to hear that under the Conservative government, instead we had secrecy, security breaches and a super injunction. Will the Secretary of State take this opportunity to reconfirm two commitments? Firstly, that this government will continue to honour the moral obligation we owe to those Afghans who fought alongside our troops. And secondly, that we will do so in a way which reaffirms this government's commitment to public transparency.
Secretary of State.
I will indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, both the continuing commitment to honour the obligations and the duty that we owe to those who served or worked alongside our forces through the ARAP scheme. We will complete the processing of any applications that are outstanding, and for any who prove eligible, they will get the full relocation and resettlement support. And I'm glad this afternoon, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be able to restore a degree of that parliamentary scrutiny and transparency that our system in Britain depends on.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for his statement. In that, he said, when this nation makes a promise, we should keep it. And I agree. In the chaos of withdrawal, my constituent who left under ARAP was made a promise by British officials that his pregnant wife could follow him. 2 years later, we have still not kept that promise. My constituent's wife and child continue to move around in Afghanistan to evade the Taliban, and my constituent is so desperate that he's talking about returning to Afghanistan despite the risk to him to be reunited with them. The Minister for the Armed Forces knows this case, and he has told me that the MOD will not consider it and is now a matter for the Home Office. So in light of this, will the Secretary of State repeat his commitment that our nation should keep its promise to my constituent? And will he undertake to engage with the Home Secretary to discuss how her department will ensure that cases like this are afforded the proper treatment in light of our commitment to the Afghan people?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I will take a look at the case he raises, and if required, I will also speak to my right honourable friend and colleague, the Home Secretary.
Josh Fenton-Green.
Deputy Speaker, can I start by paying tribute to all of the diplomats and armed forces involved in what is clearly an extraordinary operation. It's a stark reminder that our asylum system, despite demagoguery sometimes in this place, often represents a sacred duty to those who put their lives at risk for us and our allies. Can the Minister confirm to me that while the ARR is now closed, we will continue to process cases of those in the ARAP scheme since the 1st of July, including one that I've raised with officials?
Secretary of State.
Yes, my honourable friend speaks very powerfully. Where there are outstanding ARAP applications, they will be processed. Where there are outstanding triples cases that fall into the second phase of the review, that review will be completed. And where there is eligibility for ARAP entitlement established, that will be honoured.
Speaker. I thank the Defence Secretary for his statement today, but I think it does ask a lot more questions than it answers. So could the Secretary of State outline exactly how this data set came to be accidentally emailed, and can he confirm that it was indeed an accident? What was the security classification of that data set, and who was the data set emailed to, given that it is now appeared to be in the hands of the Taliban? And I appreciate he might not be able to answer some of those questions, but given this happened now 3 years ago, what level of investigation has actually taken place, and can that be published?
Secretary of State.
I think I reported to the House earlier on, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the incident under the previous ministers was reported to the Metropolitan Police. It was also reported to the Information Commissioner. The Met Police deemed no criminal investigation or further action to be required. The Information Commissioner still has this case. We're working closely with them, and I would expect before too long some conclusions and judgments from the Information Commissioner's office, but I simply can't say when.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I ran an aid agency when the Taliban came to power in 2021 and vividly recall trying to get the then government to help with the evacuation of brave Afghan colleagues, aid workers and human rights defenders under huge threat, people who had served humanity. I remember the confusion that reigned within the UK government. And to hear that the lives of tens of thousands of Afghan civilians were further put at risk by this data breach is deeply shocking. The Defence Secretary will know that under the Taliban, Afghan women and girls are enduring the world's most severe women's rights crisis. Does he agree with me that the UK must do all we can to support the women and girls of Afghanistan in realising their right to equality? Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do, and where female Afghanis are eligible for the schemes, it's been important that they've been able to apply, and we've been able to offer them the same relocation and resettlement as others. She speaks with great authority as well as passion about that period in Afghanistan. 4 years ago, as the Taliban were taking over, as Kabul fell, her characterizing of policy confusion, program failure is exactly what was going on in the British government at that time, sad to say.
Ben Lake.
For his statement, and he will know that communities in Wales across the UK have been proud to welcome those Afghans and their families who've served alongside UK personnel. Many colleagues have raised concern about the Afghans who might remain in Afghanistan or in adjacent countries and may still be in danger for the services rendered. And so can I ask the Secretary of State, how confident can we be that all those in severe and imminent danger of reprisals will receive invitations for resettlement?
Secretary of State.
Those that have received the invitations will have those honoured. But I would just say to him, the concerns that he may have about the assessment of risk in Afghanistan, I recommend that he reads Paul Rimmer's report. It is comprehensive, it's up to date, it inevitably contains some uncertainties. It identifies the risks that are inevitably there in any policy judgments that a government minister like me must take. But I would also reinforce the points he made about the welcome and the pride in which the Welsh people did then and still do now embrace those Afghans that come to rebuild their lives in our country.
Meredith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My constituent has an active application to bring members of his family currently in a third country to safety in the UK. The MOD has advised him to assume that their data has been compromised, which is deeply concerning given the nature of the work he used to undertake. He has been told that this third country cannot be supported, even though his family couldn't be safe in Afghanistan. So can the Secretary of State help to ensure that his case is accelerated, given the further danger this data leak may have put his family in?
Secretary of State.
If my honourable friend writes to me with the details of the case that she cites to the House this afternoon, I will certainly take a hard look at it.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his well-chosen, careful, contrite words with the tone that this House would appreciate on the day that it's been put forward. So thank you for that. As an MP who has often decried the abandonment of those Afghanistan who helped to secure safety for our troops and whose job put them in the firing line, I have to say that I must agree with the principle of doing the right thing and being a nation that is seen globally as supporting those who support us. The question of secrecy to this House is critical, and the Secretary of State has outlined that. Does the Secretary of State agree that the actions of government must always and totally be to protect those who were put in harm's way, and the principle of what is always right to do? I think I think of my constituent who served along with our forces in Afghanistan, and whose friend in Afghanistan, Ghani, who hides in Pakistan with his wife and 3 children. I think of him and the fear he's under. And I wonder, would the Secretary of State oblige me, please, if you don't mind, if I could send you those details relevant to that gentleman and his family to ensure that the help that we should be giving him actually takes place. I think it's something that my constituent wants. It's what I want as his MP. That's what that person wants.
State.
I appreciate the way that the honourable gentleman has raised that in the House, his concerns about this particular case, and if he does write to me with the details, I will take a hard look at it.
Final question, Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I twice served in Afghanistan alongside some of the bravest soldiers, judges and women's rights defenders I've met. And after the fall of Kabul, I was based in Pakistan with the FCDO, where I was involved in the evacuation from Afghanistan. At that time, despite the excellent work of people who served in not pitting, we saw many mistakes made by the last government, including dogs being prioritised ahead of people. This new data breach that was held secret for years is just the latest embarrassment of that evacuation. So can I ask the Secretary of State, will he consider a select committee inquiry, not just into the particular breaches in this case, but to the entire Afghan relocation system, which has failed so many times?
Secretary of State.
Well, one of the great joys of this House is that the depth and breadth of experience that members on all sides bring to debates. And I applaud my honourable friend and the insights that he brings from his own experience in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I just say to him, it is certainly not for government ministers to define the terms of any inquiry that a select committee of this House may choose to undertake. That will be a matter for those committees quite properly, and if government ministers are summoned and required to account and give evidence, we certainly will.
That is the end of the statement on Afghanistan. 2 points of order. I'll go to Sarah Owen first. Point of order.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the weekend, a member of staff in the Commons, Mobeen Hussain MBE, was publicly defamed by several Conservative MPs, including members of the front bench online. Following threats of legal action, the defamatory posts were deleted by some, but the damage was already done. It not only does reputational damage, but given the current discourse, brings serious harm and potentially risk of life. What advice does the Speaker's office have to members of this House and the other place who abuse the power dynamic of their elected office to openly defame a young staffer who also works in this House, while quietly deleting their tweets without an apology? Does this fall short of the standards expected for those who serve in this House, and would it be proper for them to apologise?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving notice of her point of order. The chair is not responsible for members' comments on social media, but I'm sure the table office will be able to advise on how to pursue the matter further. Point of order, Paul Forster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday in Westminster Hall, the Northern Ireland Veterans Petition debate took place. Being mindful this is an exceptionally sensitive and emotive issue, Westminster Hall was at full capacity and we had many veterans in attendance and many more watching online. Does the Speaker feel it is appropriate conduct for the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, member for South Suffolk, to shout across the floor that I, as a military veteran, discussing emotive and exceptionally challenging veteran issues should, and I quote, show some courage, clearly audible for all to hear. Madam Deputy Speaker, given the nature and importance of this issue we were attempting to debate, given it was shouted from a sedentary position, given the honourable member is a Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, and given I and many colleagues found this to be wholly inappropriate and insulting to infer I lack courage, do you feel this is acceptable parliamentary language? Thank you.
I am grateful to the honourable member for giving notice of his point of order, and I believe for confirming that he also notified the honourable member for South Suffolk. The remarks he refers to were not recorded in Hansard, but I will remind all honourable members that good temper and moderation are the characteristics of parliamentary language, and that heckling from a sedentary position from either side of the House does nothing to enhance the quality of debate. Okay, we now go on to, do the front bench wish to shuffle out before we go on to the next bit of business? Thank you.
Presentation of Bill. Secretary of State David Lammy.
Diego Garcia Military Base and British Indian Ocean Territory Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. I now go on to the 10-minute rule motion, human fertilisation and embryology. I come to Dame Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision about the regulation of online providers of fertility and certain ancillary services by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, having a child is variously viewed as one of the most life-changing, exhausting, expensive, thankless, frustrating,
you.